Everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on the second edition of Roadmap to Organizational Strategy on Amogate Radio Communications. This beautiful Tuesday, July 23rd, 2024. My name is Tolu Omodara. It's a joy, it's a delight, it's a pleasure, it's a privilege to have your presence with us today. We are very grateful for the privilege of your presence, and we do not take it for granted at all. You are the reason why we do this, right? So today we are going to have a very exciting and enlightening time. I want you to fasten your seatbelt, get your pens, get your journals, whatever it is that you record with, and let's get set to learn. Honestly, where necessary, unlearn, and hopefully relearn. My name is Tolu Omodara, and again, it's a joy and it's a privilege to have you with us. So let's start by doing a quick recap of some of the highlights from last week. So last week, we more or less did a roadmap to the roadmap to the roadmap. Last week, remember the title of the program is Roadmap to Organizational Strategy. And I remember saying that roadmap is itself some kind of a synonym for the word strategy. So when you're talking about strategy, you are talking about your way through the maze, you're trying to figure out how to get through a complex web, so to say, right? You're trying to figure out how to navigate uncertainties. Take note of that. Uncertainties, whether you're dealing with a public sector institution, as the case of President Biden's recent disengagement from the political landscape in the United States shows us, even in the public sector frame, even in the public sector, things can be highly unpredictable. One debate more or less tilted certain things, and that was it. So whether it's in the private sector where you have a lot of complexities, rate of exchange, wars in Ukraine, a lot of things, you are dealing with a highly complex maze. That's the truth. So strategy is like your guiding light through that maze. So it's a roadmap itself. So when we're talking about the roadmap to strategy, it's like saying what's the roadmap to the roadmap. And last week was painting the roadmap to the roadmap to the roadmap. Because last week was more or less showing us what the next 2-3 months, what the next quarter is going to be like, right? We're trying to give a direction on what the next couple of months would be. So it was a roadmap to the roadmap to the roadmap, because strategy itself the roadmap. Anyway, leaving the play of words, let's continue. So we're trying to also show the hidden insights within the insight, because what we're trying to do with this program is to give you insights, is to demystify strategy, right? Especially for the purpose of co-creation. We established some kind of a fact that strategy is agreeably, in terms of accountability, strategy is agreeably for top leadership. Top leadership has the accountability for creating strategy. However, a strategy that is going to be effectively implemented will have to be extensively co-created. I repeat, a strategy that is going to be effectively implemented would have to be extensively co-created. We're going to get into that later on when we begin to talk about the nuances of strategy execution. For now, just know that if you create strategy all by yourself in the name of being top leadership, the chances of it getting executed will be significantly reduced. Hence, if you're going to co-create strategy so that you significantly enhance the chances of it getting implemented, then while you as top leadership have the accountability for strategy creation and implementation, you must recognize that as much as possible, a significant proportion of your organization must have responsibility for strategy creation. That way, you'll be co-creating strategy and increasing the chances of engaged implementation. In other words, your employees being engaged in the process of implementing because they have been involved with creating the strategy to start with. Therefore, we have to demystify strategy. If they are going to be able to co-create strategy with you, then we have to demystify strategy. And that's the why, part of the why of this program. First of all, to enable top leadership, middle level leadership, lower level leadership, all level leadership with some of the insights, right? The word insight means to see inside, right? To be able to take a deep peep into it. So we want to be able to share some of the insights within the insight of strategy, because we are honestly very, very good at this. We've done this for over 1.5 decades. We've done this locally and internationally. We've done this from consulting to executing to training to coaching to mentoring. It is our forte. Therefore, we are happy and glad to be able to bring you the insights within the insights of strategy. So that way, your entire organization can come together to create strategy. You leading the process as top leadership, if you're listening to me, you're top leadership. You supporting the process as middle level leadership, if you're middle level leadership, and you also accepting responsibility for it if you're at the lower level of leadership, because ultimately strategy is everyone's responsibility. This is still Amoget Radio Communications. If you're just joining, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tolo Madara. This is the second episode of Roadmap to Organizational Strategy this beautiful Tuesday, July 23rd, 2024. We also shared the DIME cycle with you. The DIME cycle, this is unique to us in Amoget. We created this DIME cycle of strategy creation. That is D for development. You have to first develop the strategy. I for implementation. Then you have to implement strategy. M for monitoring and evaluation, because M for monitoring and then E for evaluation, beg your pardon, because then you have to monitor the strategy, and of course you have to evaluate the strategy after monitoring the strategy. All of this ultimately is to reinvent strategy, because the environment in which you're operating in is constantly changing. So therefore, you have to monitor, you have to evaluate what worked 3 years ago may not necessarily work now. And so you have to continuously monitor and modify and honestly, if possible, completely if necessary, beg your pardon, completely overhaul your strategy when necessary. That's when your strategy becomes responsive, right? And this is, again, I want to go back to the Biden-Harris strategy. Allow me to use that example. It's one that is very relevant to the global space right now, right? So initially, the Biden-Harris campaign focused on Biden, and then when they had to become responsive to Donald Trump's consolidation of his speaking strengths. This is very relevant when we get into the meat of today, or maybe subsequent episodes, you will see when this becomes relevant. One of the things you do with strategy is to identify your strength and organization, and to consolidate on your strengths, right? So when the debate came, Donald Trump consolidated on his strength, which is speaking. and then the Biden-Harris strategy, the Biden-Harris campaign had to respond. They had to become responsive to the dynamics, right? The environment changed. And what did they do? They simply endorsed Madam Harris. Madam Vice President has now become the leading candidate, most likely, as of today, a lot changes. If you want to see dynamism, please come to politics. A lot changes in the political landscape, but as of today, the Democratic Party in the United States is coalescing behind Madam Vice President, and she's likely to be the nominee for the Democratic Party by the time they have the convention, I think next month. Now, the point I want to make here is that the Biden-Harris campaign had to respond to that threat, right? That's why in strategy, some talk a lot about the SWOT framework. Now, in Amoget, we love to create our own frameworks, not because we are necessarily trying to show knowledge, but the truth is that God has endowed us with a lot of insights, like I said, and so we have our frameworks for strategy creation, but we also acknowledge the ones that have gone ahead of us and have some strengths that you need to take note of. The SWOT analysis, I think the SWOT framework is one that we may be referring to in this particular episode, because there are things to take from it. Now, what does SWOT stand for? It simply stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses, of course, are internal, and opportunities and threats are external. Like I said earlier, one of the things you do with strategy is to recognize and consolidate on your strengths. You cannot be apologetic about your strength as an organization. And I need to speak a little bit to leadership here. My colleague Adepoju Jayoba is doing a fantastic work on leadership competencies and organizational behavior, a program that runs on ARC every Monday. Please join her at 12 noon ET and 5 p.m. WAT. She's doing a great job. So I'm not going to talk too much about leadership, but let me just say something here. As an organization, you cannot be apologetic about your strengths. Therefore, as a leader, neither must you be apologetic about your strength. You cannot consolidate on your strength you are apologetic about. I repeat, you cannot consolidate on a strength you are apologetic about. Of course, the balance is neither are you supposed to be arrogant about your strength, right? But within the context, I want to focus on being able to acknowledge, identify, and consolidate on your strength. It is very important to the strategic process. When Donald Trump during that debate could not be focusing on integrity, with all due respect to Mr. President. That is not his strength. But he took what was his strength, he consolidated on it, and he had to shift the Biden-Harris campaign because he knew how to consolidate on his strength. As an organization, you must understand what your strengths are. I'm going to come to that later. I want to wrap up this recap of last week, but still understand that as we recap, we are also beginning to teach new things, right? So the dime cycle was one of the highlights of last week, and we also said last week that the D part of the dime, the development, may be the most strategic part of it, right? So the dime cycle, remember, you develop, you implement, you monitor, M, and then you evaluate strategy, all to the end that you reinvent your strategy. Your strategy must be responsive to changing organizational dynamics, to the changing reality, and that's where the SWOT analysis comes in. The strengths and weaknesses are internal, but the opportunities and threats are external, right? The strengths and weaknesses are internal, but the OT, the opportunities and threats are external, and the external environment can be very, very dynamic. What do you do with your internal factors that you can control, your strengths and weaknesses, as the external factors can begins to change rapidly and can very well change, at the blink, right? Kind of at the speed of a blink. What do you do with that? Again, I go back to the Biden and Harris campaign. What did they do? One of the apparent determining factors of this particular election is still unfolding before our very eyes, but one of the apparent determining factors is age. Americans appear to be complaining about the age. They want to see younger, more vibrant, so to say, contestants in the space, right? They didn't bring forth another 78-year-old to replace Mr. President. They simply brought a younger person. The advantage of age is on Madam Vice President's side. Now, Donald Trump also tried to do that, take note, with his own vice presidential nominee. He chose Mr. Vance. I don't think Mr. Vance is in his 40s yet, and if he's in his 40s, he's pretty much in his early 40s. That is, again, what they can control. That's a way responding to the external environments they demand. Now, coming to the organizational perspective, what do you do with your weaknesses, right? If, for instance, you're going in for a bid, you're trying to bid for a job, and they appear to say, oh, technology is not your strength. What do? Then you have the possibility of acquiring a smaller firm, if you're large enough to acquire a smaller firm that may have technology on their side, right? A smaller firm that is invested in technology, that has demonstrated capacity in technology, you may have all the liquidity or the cash flow to acquire them, and they may not have the liquidity, and they may need the liquidity. That may be your response as an organization to that weakness, right, that you can control in order to be able to respond more effectively to opportunities and threats. So let me take the example of Microsoft, for instance. I think Microsoft recently acquired an organization to strengthen their position in AI, artificial intelligence, and all of a sudden they took a leap. They took a leap from being behind, I think, the likes of maybe Amazon and so on, or Apple. I can't remember specifically, but initially they were not in their current position in terms of artificial intelligence. But when they did that acquisition, all of a sudden it took them forward, right? So you must understand how to recognize your strengths and weaknesses in order to respond. I'm still on the final, the extension of our dime cycle, right? That's the reinvention. All the reason why you do the monitoring and the evaluating, the second part of the second half of the dime cycle, the M and the E, is so that you can respond as appropriate. And that's another reason why you have to constantly monitor and evaluate, because the environment of operations is continuously changing, is consistently evolving. So you cannot say, oh, we had a good strategy. It's often said that organizations should create a 3 to 5 year strategy, which is fine. Some create a 10-year strategy. I was looking at the bank in Ethiopia yesterday that created a 10 years. They said they created a 10-year strategic plan. Beautiful. And then a 5 years business plan. Beautiful. But you better be evaluating that on an annual basis, and of course also on a quarterly basis. Very, very, very important. You want to carry on a continuous monitoring and evaluation, not just of your internal factors, but also of your external environments, to ensure that you are constantly, consistently, and adequately responding to the changing dynamics of your external business environment, right? Again, like I said, the D part of the time cycle is the most critical part, right? Because the reality is that strategy can be a very conceptual exercise. It's important to take note. Again, that's something not to be apologetic about. Much as we talk about execution a lot, the reason why you develop strategy is ultimately to implement strategy. You don't want your strategy hanging on the shelf. So the reason why we develop strategy is to implement strategy. That's a fact. Nevertheless, a poorly developed strategy, we said last week, cannot be excellently executed. I repeat, a poorly developed strategy cannot be excellently executed. So even by the very principle of foundation, the D is probably the most critical part. This is the first part. You need to develop the strategy before you go to implementation of the strategy. So the D is very critical. You must develop a strategy, and your strategy must be soundly developed. Then you can proceed to implementation. We highlighted the fact that there are challenges that could attend execution. Again, sometimes these are factors outside of your control. What can you do? Sometimes you have to face that reality. Again, still going back to the changing dynamics of the business landscape or the public sector environment, sometimes there are things you simply cannot control. Mr. President, for instance, could not control some health challenges. He recently had COVID. What can you do? These are things that even if a 5-year-old can have, much as you could say, oh, it's because he's older, but anyone can fall ill, right? So much as there are unique challenges that can attend execution, you put forward your best strategies and things change that you have no control over. Thankfully, there are also certain things that can similarly enable implementation. So you don't want to look at your challenges alone. You also want to be aware of implementation enablers and to seize that. And that's why monitoring is so important, very, very important. You have to constantly monitor the environment of business, the environment of public sector implementation, public sector policy development, so that when those moments come, for instance, you're able to seize those moments. For instance, in Nigeria recently, we had a gentleman, Mr. Faponda. I hope I'm getting his name correctly. Mr. Faponda created a bill recently that gained a lot of virtual attention. He created a bill. He was recommending that we consider splitting Nigeria into 8 regions. 8 regions that will be more production focused than consumption driven. 8 regions that will be more viable. 8 regions that will help us to achieve more of efficiency and so on and so forth. Now, the point I want to make about seizing the moment is that at a point, I was watching his interview on Channels Television, and then Channels Television, for those who are probably not familiar with Nigeria and are listening to us, is like a foremost television station. It can be described as one of the foremost television stations in Nigeria. And he was being interviewed, and then they asked him, "Oh, why didn't you put this forward earlier?" And he said, Mr. Faponda said, "It's not my first time. I've been working on it for a while." But what was he doing? He was waiting for an opportune moment. That's one thing I've seen a lot in the public sector environment, and I've been in the public sector environment. This is 2024. I've been in the public sector environment since 2009. I've been working on public sector reform at state, national, local, national, continental levels, and international levels for the last 15 years, right? So I think I have some basis to say what I'm saying. One of the things I've seen is that you want to sometimes have some things in the, so to say, in the cooler, like or in the microwave, depending on which is more relevant, right? Or in the refrigerator. You want to have some things just in the pipeline, waiting for an opportune moment. There are some things you do not want to push at the wrong moment, and there are some things that you do not want to lose the moment for as well. So when the environment became right, what did Mr. Faponda do? I hope I'm getting his title right. Mr. Faponda pushed it And he said, I'm going to submit this to Mr. President, that's Mr. President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and he cannot ignore it this time. Why? Because he's gaining a lot of attention locally and internationally, because he's creating a lot of virtual wave. So he's seizing the moment. He said, we had submitted this before. The previous National Assembly ignored it in Nigeria. So what's going to be different now? Because he's seizing the moment. He's recognizing that there's a moment to be seized, and he's seizing that moment. So that's the same thing you want to take note of in strategy. One of the implementation enablers can be right timing, very, very important. And that's why monitoring and evaluation is extremely crucial. You want to constantly monitor and evaluate the environment in which you're operating, whether it's in the public sector, in the private sector, in non-profit. You want to continuously monitor it and recognize when you can zoom in on a moment, when you can seize a moment, right? And that's part of why you want to gather data. Very, very important, right? So I know we've spent significant time trying to do a recap of last week's episode, but like I said, these are critical. In the process of doing this recap, we have also been learning some things. So we may not have a lot of time to delve into this week, but let me just give us some of the highlights of this week's focus. This week is supposed to be focusing on what is strategy. I'm going to give us some of the highlights of what is strategy, and we're going to come back to dwell more on each of those next week by God's grace. Now, remember what I said about a maze. That's the first thing I want you to know. If you look at all I've been saying for the last about 15, 18 minutes, you will see that I've been emphasizing the unpredictability of your operating environment. I repeat, the unpredictability of your operating environment. There are too many factors you cannot control. Even the so-called internal factors, your strengths and weaknesses, can be very susceptible to certain things that are way beyond your control. Of course, the external factors are even significantly much more uncontrollable, but so-called internal factors that are supposed to be within your control can also give way without notice. Now, this is not to minimize or in any way, underemphasize the accountability of leadership for doing your best to manage things you cannot control. For instance, as a leader, I have the responsibility to do my best to manage my health instead of giving the excuse all the time that I can't do anything about my health. No. That we're not talking about creating an excuse culture. No, we believe very strongly in creating a no excuse culture. However, the reality is that there are also certain things you may not be able to control, having done all, and that's why we will say ceteris paribus. Economics will say ceteris paribus, all things being equal, right? As if they are ever equal. So what is a maze? A dictionary describes maze as a network of paths and edges designed as a puzzle through which one has to find a way. I repeat, a network of paths and edges designed as a puzzle through which one has to find a way. My big question, how do you find a way through this maze? This is where the strategy comes in. A strategy is supposed to be like a bulb, and that's why we talk about the aha moment, right? A strategy is supposed to, by the time you share your strategy with the organization, having first examined all the factors you cannot control, the external environment, looked at the dynamics, the political factors, the economic factors, the geopolitical factors, the foreign exchange factors as part of economic factors, the human capital, labor shortage, labor excess, depending on which one you are facing, wherever you may be, the health factors, for instance, when COVID happened, and all those things. Having examined everything, that's why strategy always begins with that examination of the factors, right? Every good strategic planning process always begins with an environmental assessment as well as an internal assessment, both external and internal environmental assessment. When you finish all of that, by the time you put forth the strategy, it should be a light bulb moment. The people around you should say, oh, we see. That's why I talk about the aha moments. I like to liken strategy a lot to a light bulb. That light that shines the way through the maze. That light that tells people, say, okay, now we see the way out of this complexity, or at least a possible way out of this complexity. If your strategy does not generate that sense of, I'm not sure if you have created a strategy. So one thing you want to take note of that we're going to be building on from next week is that your strategy can be like a light bulb that, first of all, shines a way through the maze of the complexities of the local and international operating environment. Extremely important. It must shine a light on your path. It must create a way, right? I've already talked about your strategy being like a roadmap. I won't talk so much about that. We talked about that last week, and I've emphasized that a little bit at the beginning of this week's episode too. Now, that light bulb should do two things. One, it should inspire, and then it should guide. It should inspire and it should guide. Again, I'm back to the factor of leadership. I think my colleague Jayo Badikoji was talking about, leadership and the gargantuan vision that, kind of rallies people around a sense of purpose. Your strategy should be something. For me, the inspiration is extremely important. If people are not inspired to get on into the maze with that sense of encouragement that yes, we can find a way through the maze, if your strategy does not inspire action, I'm not really sure it's a strategy. Your strategy must inspire action, and then number two, it must guide decision making. Of course, that's coming more to tactics. Now I need to acknowledge my biological father, Professor Adejola Sukomi. Thank you very much, Dad. He was listening to last week's episode and was talking about strategy, tactics, the relationship between strategy and tactics. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it next week by the grace of God. It's like, making a distinction between top level leadership and middle level leadership, right? Because your strategy must be translated into tactics. And I remember hearing this from him as a child many years ago, decades ago, when he talked about going from strategy to tactics, and then you can go to the lower level of actions. The reason I want to also allude to that at that point is because, you see, when you create when you, especially as top leader, when you light that bulb in the way through that strategy, again, remember co-creation, you should still involve your middle level leadership, and especially the talented ones among them, then the lower level leadership, to co-create the process of taking that overall light bulb and breaking it into several shining lights. I think a part of me wants to stop here today. Remember, we are going to continue next week from lightening your strategy to the light bulb that first of all inspires. Now, number two is guide your middle level leadership, guide your lower level leadership, guide everyone in implementation, because they now know this is the path. What do you do? What are you doing in the maze? You are trying to find a way. That's why you guide. Extremely important. A strategy is a light bulb that helps you to find a way through the complexity and the unpredictability of your operating environment. First of all, it should be an aha moment, and finally, it should guide. Finally, for today, there's one thing I want to say in closing. A strategy must be unique to your organization, because your internal strengths and weaknesses are very unique to you. Much as the external operating environment may be common, but your internal strengths and weaknesses, to a very large extent, the specific composition of your internal strengths and weaknesses can be quite unique to you. So if you are doing what every organization is doing, the way every organization is doing it, then you don't have a strategy. I repeat, if you are doing what every other organization is doing, the way every organization is doing it, then you don't have a strategy. I'm going to leave you with that as a food for thought, and we're going to come back to those three things next week: your strategy as a light bulb, your strategy as a guide, and the need for your strategy to be highly unique to you, to be very specific to your strengths and weaknesses, crafted to respond to the most pressing of your own external environments and challenges. And we'll come back next week. Thank you. Take care of yourself, think strategy, and my name remains Tolu Modera. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for doing this yourselves. We'll be back next week. Have a good one. Thank you.